Hello, tonight we're going to pick up where we left off last week, and that is completing the MVC tutorials in part one of our course shell. And what we managed to do is get up through section 7. We got all the way through the end of it, and we did run into an error at the end, if I remember correctly, which we still need to solve before we finish 8. But we will finish 8 tonight, and then we will move on to part 2 of the tutorials before we move on to a new unit. So my hope is if we can get through 8, 9, and 10 tonight, that would be fantastic. And then at that point, I'll activate the next unit if we're ready for it. I do plan on activating it within the next day or so and adjusting the due dates for it. But that's kind of my rough battle plan for right now. So let's go ahead and bring up Visual Studio. And normally, I wouldn't be backtracking to open up something I was working on. And of course, the thing that I was working on was on a different machine. So I don't have it's not in my recent file list because I just did a fresh install on my school laptop here. So I have to go hunting for it. So if you guys just bear with me here a second while I pull up that file. Okay, so I need to open up that project. So I'm going to go to Open Project Solution. And I had been storing my work on my OneDrive. And if I remember right, this was the controller demo was the one that we were working on. So I should be able to open it up by pulling up the solution file here. And whenever you move to a different machine and you're pulling up a project, you always run into the possibility that you might have issues. And I'm just telling you that preemptively because I have not even tried to do that on this machine yet. And you can see what's happening on the screen here. It says creation of the virtual directory has failed with the error file name. Cannot write the configuration file. You need to manually create this virtual directory on IIS before you can open this project. So I'm going to see if that actually is the case. What might actually create it is when I go ahead and hit the run button, it might automatically create that directory. So I'm not in like a panic mode. But you can see that it's not liking the fact that I'm pulling it up off of a different drive. So when I originally did this on my other machine, my OneDrive was located on my C drive. On this machine, my primary drive is much smaller, so I have a second drive on this machine that I'm pulling things up from, and it doesn't like that drive letter change. So I don't know if it's going to give me like a whole series of issues like that, but yeah, and it basically, it's not letting me open the project. So I'm going to have to try a different approach here. So I'm going to go ahead and close the solution. So I'm going to try to pull it up in a more manual way. So let's see if this will help me. Now I should be able to get to the files and folders, which you guys can see up on the screen right now. And what I'm going to attempt to do is see if I can get this project up and running. If I'm not successful, fortunately I have my other laptop, so I can just switch over to it. And I just might do that, even though I just went through all the rigmarole of trying to get this open here. So let's go ahead and see if we can get this to launch. All right, and what I'm seeing is I don't have all the files here either, so it's not really even opening correctly, which is of concern. So I'm going to be switching over to my other machine, folks, just to kind of get the process going here, which is a little disconcerting, but I don't really have too much of a choice. So just bear with me a moment. So despite some difficulties after fiddling with it a little bit, I needed to go into the file that was indicated in the error message and change the path of the location of my project, because as I moved from one machine to another, my user directory where the product was, or the project was stored, changed. So I adjusted it to reflect a different drive and folder location, so it did manage to open up. And I did that while the error message was up on the screen. It was a simple enough tweak that I could make that happen. And then what I did is I went ahead and launched the internal web server, which I'm going to do again. And at the very end of section 7 in the document, after this loads up, and this is actually normal for this exercise, we were supposed to type employee / and then the name of an employee that then would get passed, received, and put back up on the screen as a string, which is working at this point. So this is actually showing the culmination of section 7 working correctly. Why it didn't work at the end of last class last time, I'm not really quite sure. It could have been because we were kind of rushing through it a little bit, I'm guessing was the situation. And I'm just checking what they're doing in the book, and you can see if you want to try it with a different name to really make sure that it works, you could type your own name in there and see that it's regurgitating it back. So all this controller demo is doing for us is showing that the first part of that URL following the machine name is the name of the controller. So it's / employee. That happens to be the employee controller. Inside that controller, we have some code. In fact, I can pull that up so we can look at it. It's not really a bad way to proceed. If we look at the CS file here, and I know that's a little small, but basically what's happening is it automatically is grabbing the name from the end of the URL. Notice that there's only one method inside here, so which one do you think operates automatically? The only method that's in there. We don't have to call the method by name, but that method does receive a string argument, which then is being stored as a variable, and then we're putting that back out onto the screen through this method. So that's why when I type in this URL, employee pulls up the controller, the / allows me to enter any snippet of text I want, right? Press enter, and it will come back to the screen. And it is a primitive example, but it does show that we're controlling the controller by virtue of the URL. Absolutely. Well, isn't that strange? Mine, coming back this week, mine is working. So I'll pause the video and I'll come around and see why yours. All right. And it turns out I remember exactly what the problem was. Thank you, Courtney, for reminding me that what we figured out was on this particular page in the PDF, which is page 32, where they show the route, we added this route. And originally when I added that piece, I put it after the default down here. So it was trying to execute the default instead of the new route. So where that particular file is located, that's routeconfig.cs. And I'm trying to remember where that one is, isn't that sad? App start, thank you. So there's the routeconfig.cs. So the fix is basically to place this part above the default. And if you remember last time, I had put that below and it wasn't working. So if you move yours to sit above the default, just like is in the book, you'll be fine. So give that a try. I'll pause the video just to make sure everybody's okay with that. Hopefully everybody got that to work here in the classroom and we're successful. So once again, I'm just going to reiterate what we did to make it work. And that is we needed to adjust our route config file, which is in the app start folder, so that this snippet of code here, this little block, sits above this block of code. When I finished off last time, I had placed that block below and it did not work. and I had made the change in the aftermath. We figured out what the problem was, and I forgot, basically. So thank you, with the help of my students, remembering. The other thing that we did here is I had to adjust one of my configuration files because I moved machines. But that's not an issue you should have if you're working on the same machine. So with that being said, we are going to move on to section 8 now, which is on page 35. So this is where we're going to pick up. And in this section, section 8 will complete the first part of the tutorial assignment that's actually due probably like a day or two after you guys are watching this video. So hopefully you get the video in time, or maybe you figured it out on your own, which is a good thing. All right, so let's take a look at this next chapter here. So we are working with the controller so far, but one thing that happens when a controller receives information from the browser or from the user is it needs to direct traffic, in a sense, or pick what actions are going to happen within the controller, you know, based upon code to make everything work according to design. So what we're going to be doing here in this section is learning a little bit about how the request processing works in this environment. What we did figure out already is how closely tied MVC URL structure is to application structure, and that is not an accident. That's exactly the intent of MVC. Once again, we step away from folders and files in terms of URL structure to controllers and methods or actions in this case, if you want to think of it that way, and with the addition of also being able to send parameters to particular controllers as well. So if you take a look at this particular little graphic here, if you look at how this works, the URL up above, you know, it's got the local host thing, but that could be any machine name out on the web. Following it is the name of the controller. So in this case, home refers to the home controller, and index refers to the method inside that controller that runs it. So what will happen is that URL will be received by the .NET engine, and it will figure out, okay, so what are we doing exactly? So it'll say, well, we're going to the home controller, and MVC will route it to the right spot, and then it will look for that particular object within the controller in order to be able to execute it. Now, there's different types of actions that we can do inside of these controllers, which is a good portion of what this chapter is about. But this little bullet list here kind of walks through the process that's used within an ASP.NET MVC application and how the routes are handled internally. I wouldn't worry about this too much for testing purposes, but it does not hurt to highlight this and maybe kind of refer to it in terms of what happens. What we can control within an application is pretty interesting in this environment, because really what it allows us to do, in essence, is also control the structure of our URLs and what people might or might not type into the application. For the most part, we really don't want to be giving users direct URLs to things. Usually we want them to go to a front end of a site, sign in, and then do whatever they're going to do, right? Assuming it's that kind of a site. Otherwise, if there are specific URLs you're taking somebody to, usually we'll probably take them to an index view, which we won't normally list. So if a home controller has an index view, we just call it to home, and it will still bring up the index view as long as that's set as default. So hopefully that makes some sense to you. Now, in terms of the type of actions that we can invoke, here's just a real quick little list of some of the types of things that we can do. Now, the one that we just tried where we put in an employee name and it came back was the first one, and that is a content result. But you can see that there's a number of other ones that you can do as well. And notice some of them relate to very specific types of actions. So interacting with your file system, for example. Interacting with a stream, right? So this actually can set up a mechanism where you can stream content through it. You can also work with other languages. So you can pull in, for example, JavaScript and trigger JavaScript through one of these, or maybe take some data and put it into a JSON format, which is JavaScript object notation. Hopefully you guys know about that. We can also redirect people to different URLs without them even knowing it. So they land on a certain controller, invoke a certain method, and all that method does is take you somewhere else. And you wouldn't believe how often that happens on web pages that you're surfing on. That's a pretty common thing. Of course, there's ones that will tell you that you're unauthorized, so if you're not signed in, for example. And a lot of these are really handled programmatically. So you would not just throw these in just because, you would have a very specific reason for pulling these up. And chances are you'd write a conditional statement, or you'd be calling something by a code that would trigger one of these on purpose. And that really kind of lends to the business logic that you would put behind it.
A website for like certain decanters.
All right, so we're going to scroll down here and notice that we're going to take a look now at the employee controller. Okay, so it says, let's have a look at the simple example from the previous chapter. And if you come down here and take a look at what we did, and really what we did in our code, and you can look inside of Visual Studio if that's easier for you, is we put in an action result where we only had one method available, and I think I already mentioned this, right? And so the reason that method triggered automatically is because it's the only method. Just as simple as that. That method received a parameter or an argument, put it into a variable, and put it back up on the screen. So really the action result was the content, and that's the name of the method that drives it. And then, of course, if you put in that URL, whatever string you would append to the end of it would then, of course, come back to the browser, because that's basically what we set up. So what we're going to do now is we're going to keep working on that same project here. So if you still have that open, great. And what we're going to do first is that we're going to take this first step, which is right-click on the controllers folder and add another controller. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to go to the controllers folder. I'm going to give it a right click, choose add, and then select controller from the list. Brings up the scaffolding dialog box. In this case, we're going to choose empty controller once again. Moving on to page 39. We are now on step number 2, and here we are going to call this customer controller. Once you've got that typed in, click add, and that'll start to do the scaffolding process, and within a few moments it will generate a new controller, which is a C# file for us, with, of course, the default action result, which is an index method which returns a view. Right now that view is empty. Moving on to page 40. We are going to add another controller now, and this time we will call the controller the home controller. Now, I do want you guys to note something. We started out with an empty project. If I decided to not start out with an empty one, and let's say I brought in like a bootstrap project, and I clicked MVC up above and add the MVC folders at the bottom, it would actually add a home controller for us, because that's one of the default ones that's created. So what we're doing right now manually is creating what normally is default. So I just want to point that out. So let's go ahead and do a right click, add controller. And this time it will be empty once again. We'll do the add. This will be called home. Click the add button, and then you can see it created this one pretty quickly for us. Now, one thing that I'm noticing here with the home controller on page 40, right at the top of page 40, is they're changing So we need to make a couple of alterations here. We are going to change this method from an action result to a string as we've been doing. So you can anticipate that below here, we're going to return a string of text. So let's get rid of view and then type in something that indicates this is the home controller or something like that, just so you know when you bring this page up that you're bringing up the right thing. Do a Control S to save that, and then after you've done that, go ahead and hit the play button, and let's see if we can bring this page up. Now, keep in mind that the home controller is kind of equivalent to like index.html and MVC application. It will launch our browser, which of course is once again on my second screen, but here it is. And we are not designating a URL here. We're just going to the root of the application. And the home controller should kick in and take us to its index method and do whatever is associated with it, which in this case is just putting up that text. So hopefully you guys got that to work. But it shows you that it's not really that difficult to add a controller, even one that would be considered default for a project. So if you were working on a project and let's say you delete the home controller, yeah, you can recreate it manually and it will be just fine. Next thing that they want us to do in step number 5, this is the bottom of page 40 going on to 41, is they want us to add a custom method inside of here. So I'm going to close my browser to stop the web server running. And then inside this class file, I'm going to add a couple of blank lines here. And then I'm going to type in the following code. And, you know, I am typing it in manually for right now. And I think it's not a bad idea to do that once in a while rather than just copy and paste from the document, just so you get a feel for the IntelliSense in this environment. So we're creating a new method called, is that the case, Ryan? You're right. This is supposed to go into customer controller. Okay, not in the home controller. Strike what I just said. All right, so I'm cutting that out of here. And I'm going over to customer controller. Thank you for pointing that out. And then what we're going to do here is we're not getting rid of the index method inside here, but rather we are adding a new method. This will require some curly brackets. So it creates the open and closed brackets immediately once you start typing them in. And then we're going to put inside here using a combination of standard HTML and Razor syntax. And I do want to point that out so that you guys are aware that we're doing that. So here we are going to type a return statement and then an @ sign. And you guys should know by now that's a Razor directive. And we are going to create an unordered list. And the one thing that I do want to point out is just like the curly brackets that we use for regular code, the double quotes inside of a Razor statement kind of end and begin the statement. And in fact, what's not a bad idea is to kind of open and close it right away. That's just like a habit I get into. I know I'm putting code in there, but I want to make sure I don't forget that closing double quote and I don't forget the semicolon, so I put them in first. And then following that, I'm going to put in the unordered list. Now the book starts the unordered list here, and you know the truth is it doesn't matter, you can go to the next line, but there it is, unordered list. And then they're going to put in a series of list items here. So they have one list item for some individuals here that I'm just copying exactly what's in the book so you guys have a point of reference. And then I'm just going to keep adding list items. You guys know who these people are? And then, of course, we're going to close that unordered list. What the book does is the book closes it down here. So if you want to do it that way, that's fine. Just remember, these are just strings of text, so it doesn't really matter too much. All right, so once you have that change put in, save that, go ahead and run the application again. This time, take note that the URL that we're going to use to trigger that particular little bit that we put in is we're going to say whatever root URL is, /customer/get all customers. The capital C in customer and get all customers, G, A, and C are caps. So my browser is up and running here. And of course, since I have a home controller, that's what it brings up by default when I launch it. All right. So now let's try that URL in the browser. So I'm going to append to this URL customer/get all customers. And by pressing enter, you can see that it is pulling up that unordered list as we hoped would happen. And if you guys are running into an issue with that, please let me know. All right, the next thing that we're going to try here is doing a simple redirect. So what I'm going to do, following the books example, bottom of 41 and going on to 42, is in the home controller, we are going to put in a redirect to a different spot. So I'm going to bring the home controller back up on screen, and we're going to change the index method. So we're going to change that back to an action result. We're going to leave the name index, and then we're going to change the return statement. We're going to get rid of the string, and in its place, we are going to put in a method that is called redirect to action. So redirect to action. You can see I'm just pulling it off the IntelliSense list here. Set of parentheses, and inside those parentheses, we're going to type get all customers. Sounds familiar, right? Comma, customer. So what's really happening in this statement is we're kind of hot wiring the URL ourselves. So what we're saying is we're going to redirect to the customer controller and pass it this method to trigger. So what's going to happen now is when we launch the browser again, or launch the application, and it tries to go to the index page or the default home page, it's going to just take us automatically to that customer list that we just created. The user has no control over it. It just takes them there. So let's run that and see how that comes up in the browser, because that's kind of an interesting little effect. All right, of course it's coming up on screen number 2 here. And then you can see, I mean, you didn't see it actually load. It just took me right to that page. But if you want, you can actually type or clear the appended URL and just go back to the root URL and press enter, and you can see it just takes you right back there. You would be surprised how many sites use this little trick. Like you go, to the root of any website, and the first thing they do is they put you somewhere else. But there's actually some browsers have scripts built into them, and Google Chrome and Firefox and Edge all do this, that if you hit a limit of a certain number of redirects, it starts going, hey, you're not going anywhere where you thought you were going. You're taking like 20 pages down the line somewhere, and you'll get an error message sometimes that says too many redirects. I don't know if you guys have ever seen that, but that's a thing, right? And hopefully you don't see that, because usually it's a malicious tactic. One or two, like, can you imagine going to a page, being automatically redirected somewhere else, then somewhere else, then somewhere else, then somewhere else? And after a while, the browser gets wise to it and says, hey, stop, this is bad behavior. So it's not really always a great practice to do this too much, but you can take a user gently from a clean URL to somewhere completely different, depending on what your operating logic is for your application. So hopefully you guys got that one to work. And if you did, we're calling that first assignment done. So we've completed sections 4 through 8, and we are going to take a break here in class.